Thank you very much, Luke. This is Phil Stevenson, and welcome everyone to On the Air with ODA, the July installment. We'll be talking about the ODA 19.8 release, and I'll be joined today with my co-host, Carlos Ortiz. Good morning, Carlos.
Hey, good morning, Phil.
And Paul Sane, our colleague, will be watching the chat and answering questions. And so let's begin. The standards safe harbor statement. Just to review, we're going to be talking about what's in the 19.8 release, sort of an overview. And in particular, we're really pleased to be talking about virtualization support for OVM on the virtualized platform for 19C database. And there are two special interest topics that are related to 19.8, and those are the integrated data guard, where you can very simply implement data guard from ODA. And we'll also be talking about the software development kit, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So let's begin. So 19.8 includes, we're really proud of this, our development group is going to be releasing this before it must end, and it will be at database release update level July 2020. So the development group's doing a really great job at keeping our bundle patches in sync with database RUs. Also in the release, there will be 19C database support and Linux 7 upgrade for the virtualized platform. And that'll be from 18.8. We'll see a little more about that. There's integrated data guard deployment. This is pretty exciting, and the SDK with the REST API. And then there's some GUI and ODA CLI enhancements. Actually, there's contextual help directly in the GUI, which is kind of an exciting feature. And then there've been additional new ODA CLI commands to support the data guard, and also some GUI enhancements for standard edition high availability and so on. So we'll look at this a little deeper. Linux 7 upgrade, we just want to talk about that a second. In terms of Linux 7 upgrade, we follow the patching release strategies. In other words, patch to the ODA release based on your previous releases. Here's a table that sort of gives you an indication of that. And there's an amplification of this and a little more detail in the release notes. There's a link below there. But we often get the question, I'm at release so-and-so, my customer's at some release, how do I get to 19.6? How do I get to 19.8? And they're different paths. We encourage people to stay relatively current in their maintenance so that they don't have multiple hops to get to the newest release, and it makes patching simpler. And we'll also bring your attention to the upgrade path for the virtual platform. So we to get to the Linux version 7, we had people go to 19.6 release, if you recall, and we didn't have a virtual platform ready at 19.6, but it's now ready, and so customers can upgrade directly from 18.8 release of ODA virtual platform to 19.8. So that's an upgrade path. And then, of course, our 19.7 customers can upgrade directly to 19.8 as well as 19.6 customers. Okay. In regards to the virtual platform, since we are upgrading the operating system, it's important to understand there's some extra tips and precautions that you want to take. You know, before you upgrade 18.8 to 19.8 in ODA base, you've got to upgrade that OS from Linux 6 to Linux 7. So there's documentation that describes the upgrade process, but it's always best practice to back up your ODA databases, of course, and back up your ODA base using rsync. And there's, this is documented well in the documentation. There's a link that describes the rsync process for backing up ODA base. And then as another best practice, it's probably a very good idea to export your VMs to OVA files. And there's a MOS note that describes that process, how to script and create OVAs from a VM template. And if you follow that in my Oracle support. And you would want to back up the OCR and voting disks for grid and clusterware. So in the case of a failure, of course, you would restore the ODA base and the guest VMs. And if you do require some additional support for restoring, it might be wise to call the Oracle support team. And in addition to that, I want to introduce Carlos. We were lucky. Carlos and I think it's safe to say, Carlos, that neither one of us was a data guard expert, but the tooling has been greatly simplified, and Carlos is going to take you through that. We were assisted by our colleagues in Austin. Tony Olson and Kurt helped us. We used their machine as our standby machine, and we were able to test this thoroughly, and so we were documenting that. So Carlos, take us through the data guard configuration and just let everybody have a look at what's going on there.
Certainly, Phil. I just want to add that it helps when our developers turn a lot of commands into a single command to set up data guard. That makes it easier. But I'm going to show you that, right? But first, just to make sure that all of us are on the same page, a quick review on the basics of data guard, right? It's a very effective technology. You can see in the illustration that with data guard, we only send the redo logs, right? And on the standby system, there is a database that just applies that redo logs, and so making it easier compared to some other technologies where you transfer the actual data blocks. This is very efficient, and the goal, right, is to ensure high availability, data protection, and disaster recovery. The standard data guard supports one or more standby databases. Right, with this one, most of our customers are just going to be setting up a disaster recovery one-to-one. Right, data guard maintains the standby database, transaction consistent with the production database, and you can switch any standby database to a production role. And I'm going to show you how we do that with the Oracle Database Appliance. Now, the use cases, right? How do we expect our customers to use the Oracle Database Appliance? Number one, right, some customers want to have a maximum availability compliant architecture, right? And we have, with the Oracle Database Appliance HA models, we have integrated rack and data guard now, right? It's to make it compliant. The second bullet here is for disaster recovery for all models, right? So customers can set up HA to HA or a single node to single node, as we're going to see on the next slide, right? But you can set that up. The number three is important. I want to emphasize here for our sales team, right, and partners. There are some customers who maybe don't have the resources, the money to pay for HA models and more licensing, but this new integrated data guard gives them the opportunity, right? Like if they want to have an available system, they can enhance that availability, right? If they have two single nodes and they set up data guard between them and have them in the same data center, right? That's just an option. And last, I'm going to show you how customers can use this, right, to migrate from an old system, say that is an ODA X5 that is a few years old, and the customer needs to migrate all those databases to a new system like the latest ODA X8, right? I'm going to show you, or we're going to see how to do that.
So Carlos, it's important to point out at this point, we've always been able to do data guard with ODAs, but it was a very manual process. I know our Rack Pack team, we put together a white paper. It was 60 pages long. There were roughly 30 steps to the deployment of data guard on ODA. But the clever developers, ODA developers, have simplified this significantly so that we can do this with multiple ODA CLI commands.
Yes, the actual configure data guard is a single command once you enter some of the data requirements, but it's down to a single command. So that's amazing indeed, right? It's so this is the first release of integrated data guard, right? And it comes with 19.8. So in this first release, you can do this only through ODA CLI, right? Only through the CLI. BUI is going to come later. All database versions are supported 11.2, 12.1, 12.2, 18, and 19. There is a feature from DataGuard, right? DataGuard Observer for fast start failover. Now or today, right? Customers can set this up on a third-party client. This is an enhancement that will be integrated in the near future with our tooling, right? And it's important to keep these requirements in mind. Today we only support doing physical standby, right? DataGuard allows you to do logical snapshots, but today we do physical. The second point, right? We want you to run on 2 homogeneous ODA systems. If you have an HA, go to an HA. If you have a single node, right, go to a single node. The primary and standby systems, they must be running the same OS. Today is going to be easy because only 19.8 is going to be the latest one, and both of them has to be 19.8. Or in the future, right, it's going to be the same system. The instance on the primary and the standard databases, they must have similar configuration on database parameter settings, including the version, the memory, CPU, networking. They're going to be running the same storage, AGSM or ACFS, just to avoid any unpredictability when we switch roles. The database shape size needs to be the same in the standby and the primary. This is important, right? And lastly, right, if a customer customizes your operating system, just ensure that that environment is in both machines, right, that is applied.
And you know, the requirement for shape size will kind of be mandated when we actually back up our production database. It'll inherit that shape size. And when we restore on the standby, we'll have the same shape size. The shape size implies a template, which also configures SGA and redo and other critical resources. So this sort of ensures integrity of the standby, and it's in sync, and you would expect the same service levels and performance on standby as you would on the primary. So I think that's important in terms of these requirements.
Certainly. So a quick overview of the high-level process. What needs to happen? If a customer has a primary system, an Oracle Database Appliance primary, with the data that they want to configure DataGuard, right? First, they need to back it up, and you can do it. We support 2 ways: NFS right? NFS or to the object store, right? It's whatever the customer preference is, but it's got to be one of these 2. In the appendix, right, we put in the instruction for the object store, just because we're being asked a lot more lately. In that appendix, you're going to find the steps to actually go to the Oracle OCI and create set up the object store, create a bucket, and then it will tell you, right, what information is required to set up the Oracle database for object store backup. Okay, so once you have a backup, right, then you restore to the standby. You define the role of that database as a standby, and then after that, you configure the DataGuard. So in this presentation, right, we're going to start with step 2. When you have a backup in the Oracle Database Appliance, we're going to go get the report, and I'm going to show you the steps here. So so here, right, on the first step, get the backup report ID. You see the CLI command there, right? List backup reports. It'll list the reports that the backup reports that you have. You take that ID. You're going to need to convert that to a JSON file, and that's on the second bullet. You can see there that we are redirecting that to a JSON file that we call backup report test db0709. Right? And then the third step, you need to copy this report to the standby system. Here's an example just using SCP, right? But once the report is in the standby system, then you'll restore, right? And here's the command on the first bullet. You see ODA CLI, I restore database, and the backup report -r, right? The unique name test PDB, in this case, that's the name is there. The ON, this is the object store name, right? The object store credential. So we did it using the Oracle object store. then the backup password, and the role to set up the database as a standby. Now, I want to emphasize on that unique name because you're going to use it, right? Later on, you're going to be using this quite a bit. The last bullet just said you can run the ODA CLI describe job to make sure that is successfully completed. Right? So once you have once you restore the database, there's this step that needs to be done as well, right? It's you're going to copy the trustor file from the standby to the primary system. Here is the location, the path, right? Copy the file. Here is using SCP. Copy the file from the standby to the primary, and you're gonna make that trust store file read only, right? With changing the mode to 400. And now, we told you, right, that you only need to run one command, right? Configure data guard. But when you type configure data guard, then it'll start asking you all these 18 different parameters, right? What is the standby site address? You're gonna enter that. We put the list here because it's important that customers understand all the data that is gonna be required, because if you're at step 17 and you make a mistake, for example, you're gonna start over, right? And in this, you can give them this file or they can put in the data, right? So they can just copy paste. But you're gonna need, number one, the site address. And I'm gonna highlight some important things that we learned, right, on these steps. But number one, the standby IP address, right? The number two typically is the default, and then the password. Number four, right? This is the path for that previous file. But the key thing here is you see that the file is going to have the standby host name, right? It's that's the difference. You need to indicate that the standby host name. Then you're going to get the password for the standby DCS server. On this next slide, right, I put in the link, and it's documented as well, right? You got to go to this file and get that trust or password right here. In this case, we are cutting that file. And then, right, database name for the data guard configuration, right, the primary database name. Then if you set up the network, some network, if not, right, the default is going to be the public. And number 9, this is an important step because it's linked to number 14, right? You're going to indicate the transport type. And in number 14, you're going to indicate the data guard protection mode. And in the document, we have this table where it tells you what are the valid values, right? If you choose async, you can only choose max performance. If you choose any other one at this point, right, it's going to fail, and you got to go back and choose one of these items that say Y, right, the valid combinations. So that's key. The listen report, right, default if you didn't change it. The data guard configuration name, choose the default here, right? It's you can change it if you want to, but it's interesting because what it does, it takes the unique name of the primary system and well, it doesn't concatenate it, right? It just adds the underscore and then puts the unique name for the standby system. And because you're gonna need this information, is good to just have it available, right? That's,
you know, it's interesting, Carlos. One of the tips that we learned along the way is we use database names and primary and standby. But once you begin to switch over and do relocates, that gets a bit confusing. So you might consider names that describe the location rather than the function of the machine, because the function changes, and it'll make it easier, I think.
True, that's another good suggestion, right? And then on 15, enable active data guard. It requires a license if you have it. Enable flashback, recommended to do it, right? But obviously take into consideration that it's going to require some additional space. 17, the trust store of the standby site should be removed. Here for security considerations, we suggest to remove it, right? And if for some reason you're gonna something fails on one of the steps and you need to restart with the command, that file is going to be removed, but you can just copy it back, right? And last one, 18, it'll change the standby database's password, right? But it's your choice. And now there's the capability or the option to create a JSON file for most of these steps. So you just enter some of the other key information such as password, for example. Okay, so important, right? Go through all this information. And here on this line, right, run configure data guard. You see the single command that we're talking about. You do ODA CLI configure data guard, and then one by one is going to ask you all the information that we talked about before. Assuming everything is successful, at the very end, you're going to see, right, configuration for database started. And once it's done, this is what's going to look like, right? You go from step 1 all the way to step 10. This was a single node on the HA. You're going to have additional information. But at the very end, highlighted in yellow, you see, right, that data guard completed. Okay.
And it's interesting, this step doesn't take as long as you might think. It moves along fairly swiftly, and it does the complete configuration, and we were surprised. It looks like it's doing a whole lot on our behalf that we don't have to do, and does it fairly efficiently and quickly.
Yes. There are some commands that we want you to use to just understand, to look at the status, right? ODA CLI list data guard status. It gives you that ID. It gives you that name here that we mentioned, and you can see here that the status is configured, right? It's the apply rate. This will show you that there's activity going on between the primary and the standby systems. Okay, with the status, and now some additional functions that you can do. At the bottom, in the illustration at the bottom, you see what if you need to switch roles, right? The primary, you want it to become the standby to service or to do some other function, right? It's you can see that on the first step, right? ODA CLI switch over data guard, you need that data guard ID, and then -u, you need that unique name, right? It's again, if you choose the default, you can see right here on the name of the data guard, right? That is the unique name for the primary, unique name for the standby. You can just pick it up from here. But if you change that, then you're gonna need to know, okay, what is my database? And then ODA CLI describe database, give it a name, and with this -j, right, this parameter here, it will give it to you on a JSON format, and here you can get the database unique name right here. Right?
And that's an interesting observation there, Carlos, the -j. He produces the output in JSON, and we'll talk about more of that when we get into the SDK.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and right, this again switches the roles. Another function, right? If you need the primary failed for whatever reason, or you need to shut it down and service it, right? You want that standby to become the primary. So we have this command here, right? ODA CLI failover data guard. Again, you need that data guard ID. Here again, you need that the unique name. And notice on the on this slide on the header at the top, right? I say on standby, right? These commands need to be run on the standby, obviously, right? Because the primary could have failed. So I'll be indicating that if it's either on the standby or the primary. But again, here, right, you need that unique name. You can take it from the data guard status name if you wanted to. But this will, ready to fill over that standard database to become that primary database. Okay, so once that original primary system is fixed or whatever change you need to do, right, you can reinstate you can reinstate it, and in the illustration you see what's going to happen, right? It's on the right hand side, it is now called the new primary, or we call it a new primary. And now that you brought the system back up, it becomes the new standby. So on the new primary, you're going to run this command, right? ODA CLI reinstate data guard, again the data guard ID and the unique name, and it will make that very original primary system now is going to be the new standby, now that the system is back up. You can again switch the role, right? So you have the original configuration where the left is going to be the primary and the right is going to be the standby. Okay, but this is the command that you follow. And then last, right, we documented this use case here. What if a customer wants to migrate to a new ODA system? In this example, if it is an X5 to an X8, right? So customer need to perform the steps that we just went through all the way up to the switch over, where you're gonna make that primary on the left, right? You're gonna make the standby the primary on the right, up to that point. Once you do that, and once your new system, the ODA X8, is your primary, then you run this command, deconfigure data guard, and you run it from the primary system. And if you see right underneath this configure data guard command, where you need the data guard ID, you're gonna see the steps that are required. Some of these are similar to the ones that we went through, right? It's you can just take from there. Well, you can see here, right? You need the username and the password. You need a trust or path and the password, so you know how to get it. And then the trust or the standby side should be removed. So it's a yes for security purpose. And that last step, it's important. We wanted to highlight it, right? Because it tells you, says the standby database will be deleted after data configuration is removed. Are you sure you want to proceed, right? You must enter yes, otherwise it's not gonna do anything. If you say, no, I don't wanna delete it, I wanna keep it, it'll just cancel the deconfigured data guard, right? We have an enhancement request, and in the future, we're gonna let you keep it. But for the moment, you gotta say yes. Okay, so that's the data guard. And Phil, over to you to talk about the SDK.
Yeah, thanks, Carlos. Yeah, I think our experience was a pretty good experience with the data guard. We found it relatively simple, and like I said, considering that we're not data guard experts, we were able to do this without really any significant issues or upsets. So that was great. So that brings us to this software development kit. And I'm just going to talk about what a ODA software development kit is. It uses DCS Agent for API and REST calls. I'll show you some examples with HTML and curl, sort of describe the methods, request parameters, and responses. Tell you how to experiment with the API using a utility that's free you can download called Postman. And more importantly, we'll talk about using Terraform, infrastructure as code sort of application with ODA. So let's take a look at this thing. Now, it's interesting, we introduced the idea of a REST API back in 2016 with the X6 models. And I remember we were always saying that this is different than Oak CLI, it's REST. And I can remember thinking, what does that mean? It takes a break or what? But essentially what we saw was a really nice browser user interface to do deployment of the ODA rather than that Java standalone program for configuration. And then we saw that we were able to enter commands that were very similar to ODA CLI commands through a browser user interface. And we realized that that's what the REST API was all about. And so essentially it was a web service that was implemented. And it simply takes JSON, and JSON is JavaScript object notation, sort of a scripting language, where we have essentially key value pairs, passes a request in the form of key values. The DCS agent on the ODA services those requests and returns a response. And that response is also key value pairs in JSON. So in 19.8, we get the SDK. If you follow to the directory OPT Oracle DCS ODA Java SDK, you'll see a single zip file there. And that's what we call the SDK. Now, when we open that zip file, we see a tree structure a lot like this, okay? We've got the java.jar file that has docs. So what's implemented in the SDK, we have real code for Java so that you could create a Java application invoking directly many of the database services like create database, delete database, get job details, and so on. in a Java application. And that's some value there. But more importantly, that Java code is simply invoking programmatically the REST API. And that's the exchange of those JSON request and response replies. So in addition, when we unzip that file, we're going to get the documentation for the REST API. And if you look at that HTML file, ODA Java SDK API doc, you'll see the complete documentation for the REST API. The beauty of that is you may not be a Java programmer, and we have some documentation that sort of gives you examples and patterns for different programming languages. That would include Android, Objective-C, JavaScript, C#, PHP, Perl, and Python, as well as HTML and curl. Now, I'm not saying that we give you code that works, but we give you a real head start if you're writing code and how the code should be formed. That's why we're calling that examples and patterns for different programming languages. If we look a little deeper, we can go to the next slide. This is what it looks like in detail, what's going on in the JDK. So we've got a PDF file in there that's step-by-step instructions on how to develop custom client Java applications to connect to the DCS agent. And it lists a sample Java code, okay? And then there's also a file that you would specify the CA certs. Remember that thing that Carlos showed you that's on the ODA for the DCS agent? We would get a copy of that on our client that would invoke the DCS agent so that he would do immediate authentication. So that's basically CA certs with a public key to establish a connection between your client Java app and the DCS agent. And then he logs things both out the application standard output and also in a logger. That's a little more detail about that. So next, we would consider the concept of, I'm sorry, Carlos, you can go to the next page. We would consider DCS Agent API and REST, okay? So what we're able to do with the SDK and that API interface, it extends those DCS services coming from the DCS server on the ODA to not only provide services for both the GUI and the command line interface, where you enter ODA CLI commands, where you enter commands from the GUI, but it would also allow you to invoke a subset of those services with HTTP, the command line URL, utility, Java, and all these programming languages. So I could do a subset of the things that I'm able to do with the GUI and the CLI and ODA CLI commands programmatically. So that gives developers some functionality and flexibility to essentially plug in those database management functions into their own custom application, but more importantly, into a scripting language. And the DCS Agent API sits on top of the HTTP protocol. So that's important because essentially the JSON request objects are sent to the DCS agent for processing, and he responds with a response of JSON, well-formatted JSON responses. So in HTTP protocol, we have start lines, we have header lines that describe what the data looks like. We have a blank line just to separate header lines from the body, but that body will contain those JSON objects, those key value pairs, for both request types and response types. So we support some methods, much like database. You can create a row in a table, you can retrieve a row in a table, you can update that row, or you can delete it. Well, we have the same kind of functionality in the calls to the API. We have essentially post, get, put, and delete. And so we'll use either a program or a scripting language to populate that set of directives so that we can request information from the API and he can return some JSON with the information that we requested. What that makes it possible to do is we can use programming languages, but in addition, we can also use those methods to invoke the DCS database services using applications that are associated typically with DevOps an example would be Terraform and Ansible. And there are others, there's a host of others, but those two are good examples because people are using those on Oracle today. Now, if you look at the next slide, this is something you could do if you have access to a ODA machine or your customer's ODA machine. If you wanted to demonstrate this to a customer, you could simply from his browser connected on the same network as his ODA machine, you could enter the public IP address of his ODA /databases, and it will return a list of all the databases to find on that ODA in JSON format. Now, this is a kind of a parlor trick, but the point being is that's the way it works. And I think you will have to authenticate with the ODA admin user ID and password. But essentially, this illustrates the GET request, and it's going to respond with databases and the JavaScript object notation response. So that'll tell you that you've invoked directly from HTML the same services that we do in BUI and CLI. And next, when we look at the documentation that's part of the SDK, we'll see elaborate documenting of all the API methods that the DCS agent. Now, like I said, this is a subset of the API methods that are in our DCS agent, but we don't expose them all. Most companies that publish an API, they have a public version of their API, and that's simply what this SDK does. It exposes a subset publicly to develop our developers and customers and so on. If you want to get a sense of this, there's a website called programmableweb.com, programmableweb, one word.com, and you can see all the 26,000 something APIs that are available from different companies and so on. It's quite interesting, and you can explore those. But this particular document here will describe the methods, the requests, the responses, and all the parameters associated with making these method calls to retrieve information about ODA databases or to create ODA databases and so on. Now, I found it useful. There's a utility that you can download free from the net at www.postman.com, and it's called Postman. And he will essentially let you play with APIs. And you can use Postman to invoke the ODA API. It's going to let you do a lot of things, but he's going to let you form your own JSON key value pairs that you'll find documented in the ODA REST API document that I just showed you. He's going to let you form headers that are necessary. We have some headers depending on which method you invoke, and you'll have to create those headers. But he'll let you manipulate and invoke REST API services from any API, but in particular for the ODA REST API. And another thing that he does quite well, in addition to that, is he will actually, based on your experimenting, invoking the API, when you get a combination of headers and body parameters, and it works correctly, it'll generate code for a number of various programming languages if you wanted to include it in Python, or if you wanted to include it in curl, and that sort of thing. So this is kind of a nice way to test this thing. You just have to have access to the network where ODA lives, and through port 7070, which is where DCS agent listens, you can experiment with Postman and invoke these API services that are documented in the REST API. Now, these are just some examples. We mentioned Java, and like I said, if you're a Java programmer, you're a step ahead with the SDK because we have very specific Java implementations and code for Java developers. But if you intend to use it in scripting languages like Ansible or Terraform and that sort of thing, you can also use it in the form of curl. Now, curl is that utility that is part of the Oracle Linux distribution, part of CentOS, part of most all Linux distributions. Essentially, it's an invocation of URL from command line Linux. And so these are the parameters that you would pass that end up being the JSON key value pairs. And then I mentioned Terraform. Terraform has its own scripting language called HCL. And so I can take that same set of parameters that are documented in our API and pass those to Terraform. And he would, in this case, create a database. Now, this is not complete code, okay? You would still need to do some parsing and checking of return codes and program logic, but I just wanted to illustrate this is sort of the way to get started, and this would be an invocation of our REST API through these other methods. Now, Terraform in particular is interesting because there's a lot of use of Terraform in Oracle's OCI in the cloud, and so people use Terraform to script a lot of different activities, spin up OCI compute instances. They use it to create object store, all sorts of things like that. They sort of script it in Terraform and they create modules that would allow that to happen quickly. So as I mentioned, this is sort of that whole concept of infrastructure as code. So there's this infrastructure that's cloud, or in our case, the infrastructure is ODA. And the ODA machine, if you notice that in a lot of our sales collateral now, we're talking about ODA as a DevOps machine. And we think this is a perfect use of ODA. And there's no reason ODA isn't a DevOps machine any more than cloud or any other platform. So with Terraform on ODA, we could invoke that ODA REST API, and we could, for instance, automate some of the provisioning of ODA database services. And we'd use that HCL scripting language to describe the steps that would take to provision an ODA service. We could also, from the same script, invoke other APIs and orchestrate sort of an execution of steps that would build an application or an infrastructure or any kind of set to perform a specific task. And I'll give you some examples here. So here's a situation. We use Terraform module, and we would first, from Terraform module, we would call the OCI API. So it's also documented. We would look at object store specifically. We'd create a container for our objects. We'd get an auth token, and then we'd collect those parameters. And then invoking the ODA REST API, we would define that ODA object store to ODA. We could create a backup plan, attach that backup plan to our ODA database, and then we could create a backup to object store. What we would eventually do is reduce that to a single module that would do that, and we could just pass parameters what database and what object store bucket we wanted to back up to. We could take that a step further in the next slide, and we could essentially, if we wanted to, say, automate the creation of a dev test machine in OCI from a database that is on ODA. So for instance, I've got tests or developers at my customer, and they want to not use the ODA production machine. They want to spin up a test environment. They could take my Terraform OS backup module, and they could combine that with a call to OCI, and that would create an OCI compute instance, and they could restore the database, and they could test until they are develop their application, and when they're done, they quit using that. But I could just make that one module in Terraform, and that would create the OCI test dev environment in one invocation of the module. These are just some simple examples, and I imagine you can think of many more. But essentially, here's a set of references. There's certainly, I told you about the documentation that's in the our ODA Java SDK and the binaries there from that file that you would unzip. There's also OCI REST API documentation for Cloud API. We can invoke OCI REST APIs using that utility called Postman, and there's an example specifically for invoking OCI REST APIs from the A team, the Oracle A team. And that'll give you some insights on how to use Postman with REST API. Also, in the cloud, they're using something called the Terraform provider, and there's some documentation for that, so you can see uses of Oracle and Terraform. And then at the past Open World 2019, Julian Fry was using ODA and the REST API with Ansible. So those are some references that you might refer to. And that sort of wraps it up, Carlos, for the SDK. So I think we've had people spellbound for long enough. There may be questions out there. So we'll just open it up for questions. Just unmute yourself or use the chat, and Paul will intercept that question.
Yes, there were a couple of questions, but I think we answered. One was a comment about, can you have primary databases both sites that have DR on the in bidirectional? And the answer is yes, and Prasad answered that as well. Then there's another question about so ODA with SDK, can we consider that like a PaaS service, platform as a service? And because it makes the database integration with ODA so much easier. And I think you know, basically our answer is yes. I'm not sure if you have any additional comments.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good observation. I think it's interesting, and this is just the beginning. This is the first cut at the REST API. We'll probably unearth additional methods that we might want to expose, and Prasad can comment on that as we see what might be necessary in addition. But it really does extend the flexibility to configure ODAs, multiple ODAs, and just management programmatically. So I think there are a lot of possibilities there that clever customers and partners will think of more than myself. But and the integration with that set of DevOps tooling and applications will really make this an exciting feature.
Okay. So there's another question about, explain more about physical standby only amount Oracle amount ODA data guard requirement. What physical and logical refer to? I believe this is just the standard data guard thing, right?
Yes,
so
this is a standard. This is a standard data guard type of standbys that you can have, right? It's for our customers, they're going to be using a physical block-to-block copy, right? It's the physical, which is for the purpose that they're going to want it. You have an Oracle Database Appliance on the primary, something goes wrong with it. The other one is just ready to be to take over, right, from the primary, basically. That's the physical.
Yeah, I think the difference is that with the regular redo log, you actually apply the database block changes, right? Whereas the logical, you actually transfer the redo into SQL applies. So that's the difference. But these are standard data guard terms. So if you just go to documentation, you can figure out what the difference is when we meant physical standby versus logical standby. Yeah,
that's correct.
So those are only chat questions that came up.
Okay, one more round. Anybody else? Questions, comments, queries? What you'll expect to see is we'll have blog versions of both DataGuard and the SDK, and additional other blogs. So stay tuned. Watch the ODA LinkedIn group and the email alias for announcements for those sort of things. And then I don't know a topic for August on the air at this stage, but we'll let you know as soon as we have a topic. And if there are no other questions, I think we can adjourn and give you back 7 minutes of time. And thank you very much for your participation and attendance. And we look forward to seeing you again in August.
Thank you.